Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cattle HQ Live. Today we have two speakers talking about closeouts and how that might aid in management decisions. So we have Dr. Christina Bakker, who's going to start us off, and Dr. Aaron Dehan that will also be joining the group to present following Dr. Bakker. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Bakker.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Walker. Good afternoon, everybody. So this afternoon, Aaron and I are going to kind of tag team on using data to help make management decisions. And in order for us to really get into the nuts and bolts of what to do with that data, we think it's really important to be able to understand the data first. So the first portion of this presentation today, I'm going to be discussing yield and quality grading. Next slide, Aaron. So for beef carcass grading, go ahead and fill up the slide. It's really important to know that we have two different entities within USDA that have to work with the beef carcasses. So we have inspection that is done by the USDA FSIS, or Food Safety Inspection Service, and that is a mandatory service. And that is what's looking at the wholesomeness of products, making sure that the food is safe, and the payment for inspection is done by taxpayers. Grading, on the other hand, is done by USDA AMS, or Ag Marketing Services, and basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort carcasses into uniform groups that we would consider to be the grades. That's where USDA Choice, USDA Select, USDA Prime, that all come in. That is a voluntary service because what it's doing is adding value to your product. And so that is paid for by the packer or whoever is wanting the grading to be done. So the grading service has been around for almost 100 years at this point. So we've had a lot of changes, but the general principle behind it has not. So the quality grades that we're looking at, so USDA Prime, Choice, Select, what we're trying to do is predict palatability, and that is, in general, your eating satisfaction. And we're going to lump those into tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. And we have a pretty good idea of what goes into making those things what the consumer would like. The other grade that we have is a yield grade, and that is the cutability. So as you see on the right side of the screen there, we've got two different carcasses. The one that's kind of in the middle of the screen, that's a much leaner, heavier, muscled carcass, as opposed to the one that's on the side. And basically what that is we're going to see that the carcass that's towards the middle has a higher cutability than the other. And so yield grades are trying to assign a number to that. So looking at the quality grades, officially we have USDA Prime, Choice, Select, Standard, Commercial, Utility Cutter, and Canner. But for the most part, we're only going to be seeing those Prime, Choice, Select, Standards. For the most part, people don't really care to pay to quality grade something that's going to be Commercial, Utility Cutter, or Canner. But for the most part, industry is going to use terms such as Prime, Top Choice, Choice, Select, and No roll. And this is determined by the maturity of the carcass, and I'll get into that. So A, B, C, D, or E, and the marbling. So that can be on a scale of devoid to extremely abundant. So your young carcasses, the A and B maturities, your young carcasses are going to be A and B maturity, and your old carcasses are going to be C, D, or E maturity. And old is often referred to as hard bone as well. So when we're looking at maturity, it actually comes down to a couple of different factors. So we're looking at both the skeletal maturity as well as the lean color. And together, we put those together, and that's going to give us our maturity score. And then we look at marbling in its own. So basically what we do is we put it on a chart that looks like this. So you can see across the top, we have maturity, and it says A, B, C, D, and E. So that red line in the middle, that's separating our young cattle from our old cattle. So you can see that the young cattle are the ones that are eligible to be prime, choice, select, and standard, while the old cattle are going to be that commercial utility cut or canner. And what we can see is that as we go across, so if we were thinking about the A, B, C, D, E line as a full-time line, the further that we get through that A or into that B maturity, you can see that we need a little bit more marbling in order to get to the different quality grades. So the degrees of marbling are on the left side there. So on the bottom, we have a practically devoid, all the way up to a slightly abundant. And basically what we have is you find the degree of marbling that you have as well as the maturity, and where those 2 points meet is the quality grade that you'll have. So for example, if you have an A maturity carcass that has a modest amount of marbling, that is going to be an average choice quality grade because that's where it falls in the middle of the choice grade. Next. So where do we figure out what the quality grade is? Well, we rib the beef carcass. So I have labeled on there the sacral vertebrae, which is towards the tail. So this animal is hanging from its back leg. So the sacral vertebrae were the tail, then the lumbar is kind of towards the middle, and then below that line where I've got the arrow, those are the thoracic vertebrae. And those are the ones that we really want to pay attention to here. So we're looking at the ossification, or the turning of cartilage into bone, when we're trying to determine the age of a carcass just by looking at the skeletal maturity. So those thoracic buttons that you can see outlined in those bottom two pictures, those are little bits of cartilage that are on the outside of the feather bones, or the bones that were coming out on the hard side of that carcass. And they're the very tips of those bones. And as an animal gets older, those bones those cartilage start to ossify into bone. And when we see in an A or a B maturity carcass is a lot of that pearly white. So you can see in those pictures, the cartilage is a very pearly white color. And if you were to actually take your thumb and push into it with your thumbnail, it would actually give just a little bit. But as an animal gets older, that cartilage turns into bone and it fuses. So as you can see on the pictures for the older, that sacral vertebrae is completely fused into one. There's no getting a knife through that. And as you can see also in the thoracic buttons, we're starting to see that the very tips of those buttons have ossified as well. So that's what we're going to look for. If we see the ossification there, we know that those carcasses are getting to be a little bit older than your A or B maturities. So there's just a progression that I have here. So you can see the A on the left side, there's no ossification in those buttons at all. And then once you cross that maturity line into those C's and D's is where you really start to see that bone start to show up. And when you get into this carcass here, this is actually an E maturity carcass. This is an old cow. And you can see that there is absolutely no cartilage left at those thoracic buttons anymore. So that would be considered an E maturity carcass. When we're looking at maturity, a lot of the times we can get it down into months. So an A maturity carcass, for the most part, is going to be something that is under 30 months of age. And those are going to be mostly your feedlot cattle. Your B maturities, those are that 30 to 42 months of age. So heiferettes are going to fall into that category. And then once you get over 42, you've got your young cows and your older cows. But for the most part, we're going to see cattle that are under 30 months when you're going into the packing plants for your regular cattle. And again, these are just estimations. There's a lot of things that can happen to an animal throughout its life that can increase the maturity of the carcass, but these are the general guidelines that we have. So in addition to skeletal maturity, we do look a little bit at lean color to determine the maturity overall of a carcass. And as you can see on this tray of steaks, these are all steaks from different animals, and color has a huge amount of variety. So the two steaks that are kind of in that bottom right hand corner, those are quite a bit darker than, say, that one that's right next to it, that third one over. So when we see that carcasses have lean that's a little bit darker, that is an indication that it could be a little bit older. So consumers are looking for a really bright cherry red color when they're looking for their steak. And those two down in that bottom corner, Those are a bit darker than what most consumers would prefer. So we will take that into account when we're assigning quality grades. Now, there's other factors that can influence the lean color, such as stress. Periods of chronic stress in animals can lead to dark colors, which is a completely other topic. But for the most part, when you're just looking at their carcasses, this is what we go by on that lean. So moving away from the maturity into the marbling, we have a bunch of different standards for the quality grades when we're looking at marbling. So we have what you see here, these pictures, kind of as our own guidelines for determining the amount of marbling within each quality grade. So on the left, you can see that there's a highly marbled steak in the picture that would be considered an average prime, assuming that that is an A maturity carcass. All the way over to the right side, where you can see that there's not much marbling in that steak at all, and that would be considered something that's a low select. And it is a continuous scale. So basically, as the more marbling that we get, the higher quality that we're going to see. So what do we see when we're looking at the industry as a whole? So the National Beef Quality Audit is conducted roughly every 5 years, sometimes more, sometimes less. But basically what that gives us is a snapshot of the industry. And the one that was published in 2022, this is the data that we saw, that in general, about 8% of the graded carcasses in the US are going to grade prime. About 74 fall into that choice, and about 17% are select, with less than 0.5% as a standard. And if we're looking at what the industry grades are, kind of the terminology that's used by industry as opposed to just the straight quality grades, again, 8% prime, but we're going to divide choice into top choice, so that upper 2/3, so average and high choice. That's where we're going to start seeing carcasses qualify for the premium programs, such as CAB and stuff like that, as opposed to choice or commodity choice is what we would consider those low choice carcasses. And that is relatively split between the two, with a few more carcasses falling into that low choice than the top choice category. And then the other difference that you'll see here is that standards in industry are generally called no rolls, because originally when carcasses were graded, they would take a grade stamp and roll it down the back of the carcass. And the standards, they're low enough quality that they don't want to pay somebody to roll the stamp on. So that's why they're called no rolls. So what does this all mean when it comes down to the palatability? Because I said that marbling and quality grades are going to be a prediction of the eating experience. So some data that was conducted in the 90s found a general percentage of the odds of a pleasant eating experience. So if you've got a prime steak, there in general is only about a 3% or a 1 in 33 chance of having an unpleasant eating experience. And this is assuming that the cook has not messed up this situation. So obviously we can't account for people's own cooking abilities, but that's the general what we're going to see is on a prime, it's a really low choice of having a low chance of having a unpleasant eating experience, as opposed to a standard where you'd have about a 50% chance of having an unpleasant eating experience. What I have bracketed there is about 20% of the carcasses that are going to fall into, or those carcasses, about 56% of the carcasses fall into that select and low choice category. And with those, we're going to see about a 1 in 5 chance of having a unpleasant eating experience. So what we're concerned with in the industry is getting carcasses out of that select and low choice range where we're having less of a chance of an unpleasant eating experience. We're doing a pretty good job with that. So looking at the data from the previous beef quality audits, we've gone from around a 55% carcasses grading of choice and prime, so not upper 2/3 or anything, just choice and prime, to this last beef quality audit where we were right about 82% of carcasses fall between that choice and prime quality grades. So we are seeing a marked increase in the quality of cattle in the U.S. So that's enough about quality. Now let's get into the yield grades. So the yield grades, go ahead and advance the slide a little bit, Erin. So the yield grades are going to be a number, and we're going to assign them 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And basically what we're looking at is 4 different factors: the hot carcass weight, the fat thickness, where we ribbed that carcass, so across from that, that ribeye face, the ribeye area itself, and then the percentage of the weight of the carcass that is taken by kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And the reason that these numbers, or what these numbers essentially mean is, it gives us an estimation of the percentage of the carcass that is going to be closely trimmed roast and steak from the round loin, rib, and chuck. So if you have a yield grade 1, those are going to yield better than a yield grade 5. So you can see in the chart that's on that's below here is that a yield grade 1, about 52 to 54% of that carcass weight is going to be in closely trimmed roast and steaks. Now, this is not boneless, okay? So the bone has been left in all of these main cuts, okay? So that's actually quite a bit higher than what we would see today. We see a lot of boneless cuts, so that percentage would be lower. As opposed to a yield grade 5, where you're only going to get about 43 to 45% of that carcass weight back in closely trimmed cuts. And it is very accurate if it's applied correctly, but with how quickly carcasses go by, you need to have a pretty good eye in order to do it correctly. So where do you take these measurements? You can see we have a drawing on the left and we have an actual picture on the right. So they're actually flipped from each other, so you have to take that into account. But the picture that you see of the steak on the right, that's the view that somebody grading would actually have. So to do the back fat thickness measurement, we're going to go 3/4 of the distance of that longissimus dorsi, or that ribeye. So from where we're standing, we're going to go 3/4 of the way up, and we're going to take that back fat measurement right there, as you can see by the black line that's on that picture. And then when we're looking at the ribeye area, we have this high-tech tool called a grid. Basically, it's a clear piece of plastic that has that grid that you see in the drawing. And basically what that is every square is 1/10 of an inch, and we are going to be counting the dots that the ribeye muscle itself is touching. Okay, so if you see on that drawing, we have the grid laid over that ribeye, and we're going to count how many dots that takes up. So if we have 100 dots, that's a 10 square inch ribeye. So that's how we get that measurement. The next one is the KPH, and this is quite a bit of variety in how people are going to call a KPH, because it's very difficult to estimate. So basically, we're looking at up in the pelvic area, which is denoted by that P towards the kind of top middle of that picture of that carcass. And then we have the kidney fat, which is the majority of the weight of that fat, kind of towards the middle of that picture. And then down towards the bottom right of those carcasses, you can see there's an H, and that is the heart fat. And what we're doing is we're estimating the amount of the weight of that carcass that is that kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. Now, we make our judging kids kind of estimate it, but a lot of the times in plants now, they have actually gone to weighing the carcasses and then cutting out that kidney fat and then weighing the carcass again, where they get a more accurate percentage of KPH. And it also allows that carcass to cool a little bit better by removing that fat as well. So these grades, for the most part, it's going to show you, you can get a pretty good idea of what those quality grades or yield grades are going to be just by looking at that 9th and 12th, or 12th and 13th rib splice. So you can see in the top left that yield grade 1, there's not a whole lot of fat on it when you're looking at the amount of back fat, as opposed to the yield grade 4. We've got quite a bit more of that external fat, and that fat is pretty worthless to us. You know, consumers don't want to pay steak price for that fat, so there's not a lot that we can do with it. So it is pretty wasteful when it comes to a consumer's perspective. So what does the beef quality audit tell us that we have for cattle at this point? So about 8% of carcasses were a yield grade 1, 30% were a yield grade 2, about 40% were that yield grade 3, 16% a yield grade 4, and then 4% was that yield grade 5. And so we're definitely falling into that yield grade 3, which is where a lot of people kind of shoot for those carcasses. I know that a lot of there's a certain percentage of yield grade 4s that people are expecting to see in their cattle to make sure they're finished enough. But for the most part, we've got a kind of a little bit of a bell curve distribution when it comes to those yield grade distributions. So quality and cutability. So there is the opportunity for you to have both quality and high cutability within carcasses. So based on the quality audit, about 25% of all of the carcasses were a choice yield grade 2 or better. So they could have been a yield grade 1 or they could have been a prime. But we're doing pretty good. About a quarter of them fall into that really high quality and high cutability, but you can also have neither. So about 1% of carcasses fall into that select yield grade 4 or worse. So yield grade 4, yield grade 5. So basically we've put on a lot of fat externally, but we have not seen the payout for that fat to get into the marbling. And a lot of the time, those cattle just genetically have topped out and we're just not going to get the marbling in there based on their genetics. And then we do have the unicorn. So approximately 0.1% of carcasses can fall into that prime yield grade 1. So it is possible. It's just not very probable. So, if we can be just getting into those choice yield grade 2s and prime yield grade 2s, we're doing pretty good, but it is possible. So with that, I invite you to think about any questions that you might have based on today, and go ahead and drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I think you did a very nice job explaining kind of where quality and yield grades come from and why they're so important for our industry. And so thank you for some insights on that. The next part of this webinar then is going to be talking about how we are actually kind of looking for those things then on our closeout sheets, especially on our carcass closeout sheets, and then kind of wrap up then looking at some of our feedlot performance sheets and talking a little bit about those, so you guys can take some of this information home and maybe make some management decisions with your cow herd. But before we get into that, I did want to ask a couple of questions. Make sure I get is there a poll that has popped up here? Give me one moment. Okay, there should be a poll that has popped up now. You could take a couple minutes to answer that. I think we've got almost everybody's questions in. Okay. I think we got majority of folks here. So overall, based off our questions, it looks like there's nobody that currently retains calves all the way through harvest, which is just fine. And then, therefore, probably not a lot of folks then that are currently using our carcass or performance data to make our management decisions. So thank you guys for your input on that. Although if, most of our folks here then don't retain calves through harvest, I think there's some good insights we can still gather from today's presentation, and I'll go ahead and get into that. I'm getting okay, so closeout sheets, there's a variety of different forms. I'll get more into those. I'm going to first start on the carcass side with first just kind of giving a caveat here that you know, carcass closeout sheets, they vary from plant to plant. And there's different types of closeout sheets you can get within each plant too, depending upon how you market your cattle. But I will say a big take home point is that in order to get your individual carcass data back, you do have to market them on a grid. And so that's something to consider moving forward if you want to get individual carcass data back and see how your cattle are performing individually. But this is just an overall, I think, good generalization of what a closeout sheet could look like. This one is a little bit dated, almost 10 years old, so don't take the numbers too close to heart here about where we're at for our prices. It's glad to see we're doing a little bit better in today's industry. But overall, just pointing your attention to the top of the sheet, some things that Chris had brought up. So majority of our I guess our gold standard where we base our prices off for our cattle is a choice yield grade 3 carcass. And then we will adjust our premiums and discounts based on the quality of those cattle. And then ultimately those are summed up to give us an individual price per hundredweight. I will say that all these adjustments have been accounted for up here at our top right, but we can take the bottom of the sheet here then further breaks this down into where those premiums came from. For instance, I guess these headers here are lined up and are correlated with our adjustments up top. But so for the different premiums and discounts we can receive, for instance, can come from different branded programs, such as certified Angus beef. And then it breaks us down into our different quality grade proportions, as well as in our yield grade proportions, weight, some other discounts. We have our 30 plus, so that means our 30 months of age and older discount as well. This particular group of cattle performed pretty par for the course here, pretty on average. I think, Chris, you said most of our, as far as our yield grades, 2s and 3s, we had a majority of our cattle landing in there. And then majority of our cattle, 37 out of our 47 had actually falling within those choice or within that choice category. So overall, pretty average lot here, but it kind of breaks it down in a summary of, what we would, or of how those cattle performed. A lot of times this is accompanied then with actual individual carcass data where it further breaks it down as to how each individual actually performed. I will say that this particular sheet is not correlated with the previous one, but thought this one was a little bit easier to read and had some more of the things that we were talking about. And so there's just some general things that come with these individual carcass data sheets then, including the carcass ID that they are assigned once they are harvested at the plant. They also will scan in an EID if they do have one of those tags present. Can match it up with your ranch tag. And then it gives us our individual data based off from the parameters that Chris talked about previously here. And overall, we can use those then to calculate our yield grades and our quality grades. These are probably, we've talked a lot about some great information here. And if you don't remember anything, I think some good takeaways are just to be looking at our quality and yield grades. That can give you a good indication for where you're falling at relative to industry standards. As you can see, all the cattle in this particular group here were 100% choice or better. So they did pretty okay. We'd be pretty happy with these results. And then based off from the grade that they are received, that dictates their overall price per hundredweight at the end. And it gives us then an individual carcass price per hundredweight as opposed to just an average price. We do still get an average price down here at the bottom, but I think this is valuable just from the stance of you can see, trace it back to your ranch tag, see who is performing better than the others. For instance, this particular group had a couple prime yield grade 3, so they're doing pretty good. So maybe, you know, you can take that back and see which cows those came from, et cetera, that way. So a lot of good data that can come from just as individual performance data. There's also different grids available depending upon, you know, how you market your cattle. These will vary plant to plant as well. There's numerous different grids available, but I wanted to show you guys this one because it has a couple different other things in here that are becoming more common to see on some closeout sheets. And this one's also, this one isn't 8 to 10 years old like our previous sheets. This one is just from last year. And so a little bit closer to where we're at in our industry. But for instance, this particular grid is designated for cattle that we expect to grade pretty, you know, have pretty high quality grades. If we can see, we have a threshold column here on the right, and we have a 70.5% that's across from our choice or higher. So what this means is our lot of cattle that we send, it needs to be above that 70.5% threshold before we'll start receiving the premium here listed for a choice or even a prime carcass. And again, this is because we expect these cattle to perform pretty well. We also see quite a high premium for those carcasses then that are above that designated threshold. And kind of the same thing here, then following down to our yield grades 1 and 2. But then we also have it on the flip side here. If we're getting, you know, we have a threshold then for if we have too many cattle that are a little fatter, so on that yield grade 4 to 5 end, or if they're either too light or even reaching some of our heavyweight discounts down there. But again, I think an overall summary you can get out of this too of what the industry is looking for is a lot of high quality cattle, as well as we're willing and able to accept some more or some fatter cattle as well as some heavyweights in order so we can get that higher quality in those cattle. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly then on the carcass side before we move into our feedlot closeout stuff is the USDA price or beef price carcass equivalent index. I put this up there because this is available to everybody and it's updated on a weekly basis. And it kind of gives you an idea of what packers are offering a premium or a discount for, as well as it can be a challenge to get, you know, our specific grids back from our plants, or even to kind of know what to target, especially if you've never retained cattle before. And so this is just, I think, a good baseline to start at and give you an idea of what we're looking for. And so obviously there's a lot of information on here, but I'm just going to highlight a few things that we're talking about today. One is, again, this is based off from our yield grade 3 choice carcass, and it's in a weight range for about 600 to 900 pounds. So this is a pretty average carcass here for the industry, or what they will base these prices off from. And then looking down at the bottom of our sheet, then this further dictates, you know, what are we getting rewarded for at the packer. So we start with our basis value, and surprisingly, it's the same value as up at the top. And then we are getting rewarded more for if we have a prime carcass that falls into a yield grade between 1 and 3, as well as for some of our certified branded programs, et cetera. That way we'll start getting discounted once we get to our lower or our no roll grades. And then we'll also receive discounts if we're too light of a carcass, and actually quite a substantial amount for that. But again, willing to take some fatter and heavier carcasses as denoted by our average or by our equivalent index here. So again, just kind of wrap up on the carcass side here then is, I think some key takeaways that we can get from just some of the information that's present currently is, and even on your closeout sheets then, is what the packer is looking for. And currently, like I said, in previous slides here, the industry is looking for high carcass quality cattle. So again, and even Chris had mentioned that we're about 75% choice or better as an industry. Excuse me, we're 75% choice and prime carcasses in our industry. And so obviously we're wanting some high quality cattle. We're also willing to accept fatter cattle and some that are even heavier weights, again, because we're trying to still produce quite a few pounds of beef to meet our global demands. And then on your side, then some things you can gather from a carcass sheet is helping you to determine if you've achieved your carcass performance goals. So this is just a couple examples here, and we could take all day here to go through various scenarios, but it can allow you to compare yourself versus even the plan average. I know on those first couple of sheets, we were performing basically at the plan average, not getting much above what they would be expecting at that time. You can also compare yourself back to what you'd expect to get based off from what your herd genetics would say you could do. And so it's important to know what your propensity for your cattle are. So then when you go and harvest these cattle, we can compare that and know, how we're doing and if we need to make any management decisions. And then just kind of walking through a couple scenarios down here at the bottom. So say for instance, we had, some good quality grades. So let's say we were about that second sheet I talked about where we had, 100% choice or better, but we had a majority of our cattle that were, let's say all of our cattle were yield grade 4s and about half of them were yield grade 5s. Probably we just have an overconditioning problem here. Maybe they're on feed too long. I know that this kind of maybe happened during COVID, but it's just sometimes you can't, there's not a lot you can do about that, but the next step then would be to get those cattle to harvest sooner. Then on the flip side, maybe we're kind of average on our yield grade, but we have poor quality grade. This is probably coming back to some decisions we can make on the cow-calf end where we could be selecting for better quality grading characteristics, selecting from our marbling, et cetera, that way. So next I'll kind of quick talk about our feedlot closeout sheet. And as with our carcass data, these are pretty variable depending upon who you're feeding or who you have feeding your cattle, et cetera, that way. And if you're doing it yourself, you may not have your own closeout sheet, but and so another thing, I'm not going to focus too much on our financial end of things just because, again, this is a little bit of an older sheet, but that can be a little bit more variable. And I think the better thing that I'd like to focus on today is how we can look at our cattle performance in order to make our performance decisions. And so we'll primarily pay attention to the information that's available at the top of the sheet. And it just gives us some general information for, how many head we had come in and at what weight they did and how many actually went to harvest and at what weight they went out at. Obviously, this is a little outdated for where we're at for our finishing weight there. Also gives us an estimate of what our average dry matter intake was. And then over on the right side here, we have some more of our performance data. You'll notice that we have a deads in and a deads out column. So if we go back to our sheet here, we see we had one head that had actually died during the time here on feed. And so with the deads in data, it includes that animal that had died and includes its performance, whereas the deads out, it removes that animal and it gives us an estimate of how the cattle that were performing up to par and performing all the way through the feeding period until they were harvested. And so just some things to note here then that are important to pay attention to. These are all important to pay attention to, but some things I'd point out here that I'll talk about on the next slide then are our days on feed, and then our average daily gain, as well as our dry matter conversion. So we're about 154, 355, and 6 to 1 respectively with those. And I point those out because, again, it can be kind of, if you've never done this before, or even if you are a cattle feeder, it can be kind of hard to dictate how your cattle should be performing. And I think a good reference for this that gives us some industry averages of what cattle are doing is on our some data out of Kansas State on their focus on feedlot survey. And it gives us a monthly update of what cattle are closing out at. And kind of gives you, I feel like, a pretty good range for what you could expect for some cattle on feed, especially if you're new to the game. And so, thinking back to the data on the previous sheet, they were about 154 days on feed. This is at the bottom of this range, but that data is also from 7-8 years ago. So it's not surprising it's maybe on the lower end here. But in terms of our average daily gain, we were about a 3.5, so we're about right in the range for where those heifers would be at. And then our feed conversion was a six pounds of gain per, or 6 pounds of feed per 1 pound of gain. And so we're performing better than what our industry average is for today. And our death loss, we were at 1 head, and that was about a 2.8. And so we're a little over with that, but overall, I think it's safe to say that these cattle are performing pretty par for the course. And so I think that's something good that you guys can take home and just understand that your cattle were performing as expected. And so, again, kind of wrapping up our, overall understanding of our feedlot closeout sheets. I think we can use this again to determine if we were able to accomplish our performance goals. And again, I would advise you to look at, if you have previous data from finishing out cattle, to go ahead and compare that to those cattle. That's going to give you the best representation if you're meeting the mark or not. And if not, again, refer to some industry available data such as that focus on feedlot survey. And then from there, we can use, we have a couple of different scenarios there to discuss if we're meeting our operation goals. So let's say both the scenarios is that we're having poor growth, but okay, was the poor growth, was that attributed to, say, a weather event? Maybe it was really cold and snowy, or on the flip side, maybe we had a extremely hot weather event, or so that could have caused some dips in our performance and our feed efficiency. So we could also, it could be that cattle maybe needed to go sooner. Could be variable based on if you had a new feeder, maybe we need to change our diet or get them on a finishing ration sooner. There's a variety of different things that way. But then on the flip side, where it's maybe more of a genetic effect, is say we're doing all the things right on our feedlot side of things, but maybe these cattle just still aren't converting and are still just having poor rates of gain. So maybe that's something we need to come back to our breeding selections that way. And so it could be a challenge to determine, is it more of a genetics, or is this more of a management correction? And it's hard to know that until you actually get into the data, you actually finish some cattle out and kind of know what you should, or what your expectations for your herd are. And so I think if you aren't, and then on the other piece, on the genetic side, this can be a challenge too, because even if maybe we've been feeding cattle out for a long time, or maybe we're new to the game, but these cattle aren't performing as expected. We're a year out from making our next breeding decision at this time. And so it can just be a slow turnover process, but as long as we're keeping accurate records to make sure we're moving the needle, I think that's really important. And then on the management side, we just want to make sure we have as many good days on feed as possible for these cattle. And what this means is, making sure our feeder's doing what we'd expect them to, getting them up on our rations and making sure that they're performing as we'd expect them to. Maybe then on our side too, it's making sure that we're having proper administration of vaccines, making sure these calves are healthy and prepared as best as they can before they even arrive at a feedlot. If we're missing the mark on growth, and we're not using implants, probably be a good idea to consider using that. And then also, if this is something you're new to, it's always good to gauge, you know, the experience of your feed manager and your feedlot operator to make sure that we can set our cattle up for success on that end as well. And sometimes, like I said, we just need to experience replication of retaining these cattle all the way through. And so I know a majority of you guys in the poll said before that you don't retain calves all the way through harvest. And for you guys, so why should you care about this and care how overall your cattle do on the rail? It's because, I mean, after the weaning event, these calves do end up in somebody's feed yard and will eventually end up hanging on a rail somewhere. And so it's important to consider how management decisions we're making on the cow-calf end ultimately can impact this carcass while it's hanging on the rail. And so overall, we need to just, whether it's, you know, folks on the cow-calf sector, maybe it's coming through the feedlot, but trying to find ways to best manage our cattle in order that they are able to express their full potential and set them up for the most success that we can. And so in summary, I think overall it's important to understand where you're going, to know if you're meeting your management needs. So coming back to what are your overall operation goals? You know, are you wanting to chase carcass quality or not? And if you are, I think it's important to think about ways to know if you're actually meeting that target or not, maybe taking the jump and feeding them out. I think there's also a lot of value in knowing what the industry expected metrics are. So for instance, it could be looking at other folks' closeout sheets if those are available, looking at some of our feedlot survey data, looking at our price equivalent index, and kind of gauge it where, you know, what our end users are wanting. But again, it's kind of hard to do all this and make changes if we're not keeping records and actually going through and interpreting that data. And so I'd advise you guys to take that into consideration and assign yourself some of your own goals to make sure that you're moving the needle with your herd. And like I said, if you're not sure where to start, if you haven't fed cattle up before, I feel like it's a great opportunity, and it's something that I hope you guys would take advantage of. And we actually do have an opportunity for that through SDSU Extension, through our Calf Valley Discovery Program with Dr. Julie Walker. I might have Julie pop in here quick and give a quick spiel on that if that works.
Yeah, if I can get my, so we have the calf value discoveries, so you enroll your calves. They need to weigh between 500 to 800 pounds, probably closer to 600 for the accelerated feeding program that we put them on. We finish them to finished weight or where we think they need to be harvested. We ship them in semi-loads next spring, summer. And then you get back your carcass data as well as your feedlot performance. So if you want to just have a snippet of your herd to have an understanding of what's happening past weaning, it's a good opportunity for people. So myself or Dr. Warren Rushu, either one of us would gladly visit with you. Our deadline is next Monday, but if you want to visit with us, we certainly can do that. Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And one more quick thing before we wrap up, I just wanted to note that we are also planning the schedule for next year's Cattle HQ Live webinar series. And if there's any topics that you would like to have us discuss in 2026, feel free to drop them in the chat. Or if you come up with something later, feel free to reach out to Julie or I and send us an email. There's Chris and I's contact information. And with that, we thank you for your time today, and we'll take any questions that you have for us.
Yeah, so if you guys have, I shouldn't say guys, but individuals have questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll gladly get those answered for you. Our wonderful John Green just put the link to the calf value discovery in the chat, so you have that if you need that. But as people have the opportunity to drop a question in the chat, I have one. So and I'm not sure who wants to answer it. So I know, Chris, you talked about dark cutters and you just did a snippet on it. So what are the characteristics? So I can have like maybe get darker red meat when I harvest my cattle, but it's not a dark cutter. So what's the difference between a dark cutter and just maybe a little more red meat? I don't know if that's the right way to put that. Or not as bright and cherry red.
So yeah, I can go ahead and start on that one. So dark cutter is essentially it's going to be a product of a chronic stress situation. And when I say chronic, I don't mean that it has to be an animal's entire life that they were under stress. It can be something as simple as a heifer that's in estrus or that wasn't heat before it was slaughtered, or it can be a period of heat stress or cold stress. And for the most part, when we see those, it's only a few days. But what has happened is that the animals glycogen stores or their energy stores within their body were depleted, and as a carcass muscle becomes meat, we like to see a drop in the pH of that carcass, and when we've depleted that glycogen, we're not able to see that, and so that's going to keep that muscle to be quite a bit darker, and it's gonna the safety of it's not a problem, but it's going to have that higher pH is going to change the flavor a little bit. Some explain it as kind of a soapier flavor, but really what we see is a problem with microbial loads, and because it's more of a neutral pH, bacteria are happier in that environment, so you could see spoilage a little bit faster. So the difference there is that we're not seeing that drop in pH, and an older animal that's going to have that darker meat, that's actually a function of the myoglobin, which is the protein that makes the color of that meat. There's more of it in an older animal. So they're still going to have that normal drop in pH that you would normally see. It's just we're starting with a product that's going to stay a little bit darker. So as how you tell in a plant, it can be a little bit difficult as to which it is. But that's where we fall back onto that skeletal maturity and that dentition as well.
And I hate to say it, the graders do a really good job about finding those, and they have lots of skills within that wheelhouse that I wouldn't have if I was there at that line. So, yeah. So for Aaron, I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat. So if you have any, please drop them in. But so what's one key that you would tell producers? What's the one thing if they're going to start using a closeout or developing a closeout? What's the number one key thing that producer needs to start with?
I think in general, overall, it's good to go ahead and take a deep dive into all the data that's coming from there. I think that's and make sure, I guess on the carcass, let me start first on the carcass side. Go back to that individual carcass performance sheet and kind of see, who, I guess I'm kind of more on I like seeing a higher quality carcass, something that's probably average in yield. But going through and looking for the cattle that are meeting your specifications and meeting your goals, and if we can trace that back to who the dam and the sire is, maybe kind of using that for our next year's breeding decisions. And again, so yeah, looking at it, I feel like two big things then on the carcass side of then are obviously looking at our quality and yield grades, but then you can do a deeper dive into that, especially say on the yield grade side of looking at, okay, why did we, how did we get to this, say a yield grade of a 3? Maybe we had a larger ribeye compared to something of a similar grade. but yeah, kind of doing a deeper dive into the factors that influence those overall grades that they were assigned. And then kind of doing the same thing. I know it's a little bit harder than on the feedlot side. We don't necessarily get our individual data. It's just more of our average lot data. But again, I think looking at how looking at overall performance, comparing that back to our kind of expected or our industry standards is good, as well as back to what the capability or like if there's any available data available from our feeders. Feel like if we can compare that to know kind of how our cattle did compared to the average, I think that's important. But I think all the data and all that aside, a very important step, especially if you're choosing to feed cattle out for the first time, is to go to that feedlot you're planning to feed at, or even have a few in mind, going and having in-person conversations with those cattle feeders, looking at their pens, looking at, you know, their commodity storage, all the things, having those conversations to make sure that you're confident to put your trust in them to feed the cattle all the way through, and get them to harvest. I think that's a very important step. And then just having good communication then with our cattle feeders as well. I mean, they do more than just feed cattle. I guess they're there for, I know a lot of folks that call them up just to seek life advice as well. So I think having a good relationship that way, both on a personal end, but on the business end, is important as well. And I think can give you more confidence too in what you're doing on the producer end as well.
Okay, so I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you think of a question later or you didn't want to ask it today because whatever, you're not sure you could word it right and you want to ask it verbally versus typing it like I would want to do, don't hesitate to reach out to Aaron or Chris. They would love to answer that either by email or phone. And we look forward to seeing you guys or having you on next week or next month on November 20th with Russ Daly. So with that, I thank you and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.